because maybe they cannot get that kind of education that they would have. Maybe they would be thinking that we should invite other people who could teach, my son better math, who could teach my son some other, these kind of particular subjects that you cannot simply get in your local schools. Now let's go to the third issue. Let's talk about these particular projected image. Because the only good thing that these status quo is doing right now is that it actually gives us more hope. Either both in the international level and second in the domestic level. In the international level, it actually creates an image that as if these particular despotic regimes will have the chance now to reform because their sons and daughters are actually receiving all these Western democracies because they learn the history of wars and whatnot, and maybe they could actually create changes in the status quo. But we've already talked to you about that that's not how simple politics is all about. It isn't only about you. So at the end of the day, what we're saying is that you're actually creating a false hope in the international community. And worse, you're only legitimizing also this kind of despotic regime. That just because you have this kind of hope that maybe in the long run, the moment the son would actually replace his father or his uncle, then maybe that change would actually happen. We've already proven to you that that will never happen. But worse, what you actually do in that is that you give also false hope coming from the local community. That maybe we should endure more pain because the moment this particular leader would come, maybe then he will save us from this kind of situation. And we then again say that those things will never happen because at the end of the day, politics is politics. It isn't really about, serving, the greater good for your society. If you're talking about despotic regimes, you simply talk about power, how to maintain this kind of power, how to become more powerful. And when you talk about despotic regime, the game there is about holding in to your power. So that's why at the end of the day, we say that maybe this would be the solution, the tipping point, that at the moment that you actually stop them from going to these particular schools, and maybe the situation would change for the oppressive regimes. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 29 seconds.
Okay, thank the government whip. I'd like to now call upon the opposition whip to the podium.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think CODS is going to do as well as I am without Logan around in this country. Because I see a lot of flaws that's happening, especially, and I can see that it's coming from Jan. And I seriously worry for you, NC. Maybe you should step up a little more and have a rebel like you want to pursue in these countries. The problem here today is that the government team wants to do so many things. They want to gain moral high ground by not accepting blood money. Look, fellas, you don't get moral high ground by narrowing down the debate like that. But even more so, they don't want to help these regimes. They don't want to legitimize them. But when we have to still have a clear idea of what kind of regimes we're talking about. Are we talking about regimes like Gaddafi, like the guy waving around the green book and saying America is bad, EU is bad, Europe is bad, and then he's going to turn around and tell the public, my son went to LSE, he must be a very smart son. Well, that doesn't make sense, ladies and gentlemen. So exactly what kind of people are you dealing with? What kind of change do you want to make? The marginal benefit here that they're talking about doesn't really make sense. I'll get to that point when I'm dealing with isolation versus engagement. I have 3 issues to talk about today. First of all, whether or not discrimination can ever be justified, they never answer this question. Secondly, I'll talk about isolation versus engagement, sit down, you've done enough damage. And lastly, we want to talk about what is the impact of legitimacy that they think is so detrimental to international relations today. And that'll be about it. So, first of all, can discrimination ever be justified? Your last chance, sir.
Okay, there is a lot of bank is discriminated because this is a part of essential. Why university is different?
Because they're not governments. That was the first point from the government team. Universities are independent. Sit down, you've had a chance. And the universities, like this one, is an independent group of people, scholars, and also it's a business that actually runs without government regulation, which is why this auditorium can have a cross right there, although we're not a Christian country, Mr. Speaker. A university is not a representative of a government. A university is not a foreign political tool. That was the whole point of Elmo's first argument. They should listen better. But more importantly, can discrimination ever be justified in 2 levels, Mr. Speaker? First of, for that child, that is the individual applicant, can we turn around to him and say, no, you don't deserve to be here because your father is a bad, bad man? Number one, Mr. Speaker, in our society, we never discriminate people or punish individuals by association, Mr. Speaker. If we see accessory to crime, like the son of Gaddafi, that is a different issue. But can we ever turn around our backs to a child that has, glittering eyes, say, I want to learn, and say, no, you build your own university in your country, Mr. Speaker? I don't think so. That is inherently immoral. But more important, we want to look into whether this is an issue of that's worth discriminating these children. If they say, I want to be educated, and if they say, I studied the SAT, I studied everything that I need to do, and I am qualified, will you please accept me? Will that actually be beneficial to the educational environment? No. Why? Because number one, the university in liberal democracies often say we do not discriminate people. We should not be mean to each other. We should be based on meritocracy. That's the whole point of capitalist society that we live in today. But more importantly, you lose out the chance of education for the students there too. If I was a student in Harvard, or even in EHA, when I was studying, I would have liked to see a different point of view. And diversity is the key for more inspiration and more innovation. And that discussion does not happen unless you put everybody there. They want to set up a Harvard in Pyongyang. Number one, it's not going to happen. But number two, even if it does happen, it'll be a Harvard student, quote unquote, made of good leaders of Pyongyang kids. You don't have that kind of discussion there. Even if these dictator sons are partying around in London, they will come across more people with different point of view. They will have more exposure, and that was our point. Yes?
So, if I see a lot of people in the New York City and England, why do they give up their privileges? Because that region is run by their family and a political party.
For that question to make sense, you should have told me what privilege they're giving up. You wasted your POI. Second argument. Second issue, isolation versus engagement. The whole thing that the government team wants to do here today is to extend the level, extend the level of isolation we already have in status quo. They want these universities to be a political tool, a governmental body that says we are going to be a part of this foreign policy too. We are going to extend our sanctions against the children of these regimes as well, whether or not, regardless of whether they agree with their fathers or not. Sit down, no more points. So let's see if isolation actually works. Number one, we see that isolation fails in bringing down regimes, Mr. Speaker, especially if it's a cultural isolation on top of economic isolation. That's the case in Cuba, that's the case in North Korea. We don't see any kind of new discourse right now, and that's essentially because we're not having more interaction with these children. Now, Mr. Speaker, the status quo of accepting these children and accepting different students from different regimes, if they are qualified, is the last chance we have to engage these children, Mr. Speaker. And they claim that, what did they say? They claim that the government will only increase the legitimacy and only brings more harms to these individuals. Those harms are already there, and those harms are further perpetuated by the isolationist regime, the isolationist approach that we have against these regimes. And we say, well, if you actually extend this, you're stepping over the line of private sector of university education, and also you're saying that we don't want any interaction at the same time, which is a problem on their side, Mr. Speaker, because their alternative is that we want to help them make a Harvard of their own. See, what happens when you tell a child that is not malicious, that is able to qualify, and that wants to be educated, saying that I don't want to educate you here because your family is bad? What is that child actually going to come to you again and say, well, if I don't get accepted, please accept my invitation to bring you to my country? That's not going to happen. That's the problem of isolationist arguments, Mr. Speaker. The very fact that you turn your backs to them and there's no more kind of interaction. There is no more possibility for them to want you to come to Pyongyang and teach them debate, Mr. Speaker. They will only fall back on the legitimacy that actually exists right now, which is my last point. Mr. Speaker, in the very case of status quo, even if these children don't go to Harvard or LSE or wherever they want to go to, Mr. Speaker, they don't need these degrees to actually have legitimacy within the closed structures of their own regimes. Because it's so isolated already, their public is not as exposed to other cultures or democracies or kind of academic achievements, Mr. Speaker. They already have the religion of Chuche, saying that this is the God, and that kind of religious legitimacy is already there. What actually happens when we do give education, however, is that those individuals, we are trying to help them have doubts upon their own regimes, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, we say do not deny education, do not blame opposition for trying. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 35 seconds.
I thank the opposition whip for his speech. I'd like to now call the last speaker of opposition.
A mock debate is supposed to teach you what to do in a debate. The government team is giving you a classic case of what not to do in a debate. Seth comes up and says bribery is bad. We told you we don't have to bribe them. NC comes up and says we have to sanction them, education is a policy of sanctioning. We told you that education policy should not be used as a politicization of sanction. And Jen tries to save the case by talking about like marginal benefits, right? We told you that's simply not going to happen. Like I spent enough time to tell you that you know Harvard University version of North Korea it simply isn't going to happen, and it's going to be bad because they're going to teach world history, you know, in Juche philosophy, right? You know, Kim Jong-il was the center of the world. He invented like you know liberalism and those stuff. So the two questions in the debate is basically number one: is there any justification for discriminatory measure in a liberal democracy in a university, ladies and gentlemen? The second question of this debate is that of change, whether or not their policy or our policy is going to create any change. And we told you that our policy is much better in terms of creating change. So, number one question, we told you from the get-go that this action is discriminatory, right? You should not be, you should not be said no in terms of acceptance of Harvard just because your father is fatty and ugly and a leader of North Korea and killing people, right? That should not be the criteria. We told you that meritocracy, that as long as you're smart enough, you should be accepted as a student in those good universities, because first of all, that is the principle of democracy. And second of all, university, we told you, is an independent education and research institute that does not does things for a political agenda. And they've yet failed to prove that why politicization of university agenda is actually a good thing. And they tell you that it has to be politicized, a sanction tool, and maybe it gives us the leverage to change stuff and so forth, right? So first of all, we told you from the get-go that education should not be politicized. No response there. Second of all, we told you that their stance is very contradictory. Like first of all, they want to shut them off, send them back home, and then secondly, they want to create Harvard University on their own. Simply not going to happen if you're shutting them away. In terms of if you're stepping away more and more from Western University, then you're stepping away, right? Their characterization of inviting math professors in North Korea simply isn't going to happen, ladies and gentlemen. On the third level, government case is not really conditional. NC comes up and says it's going to create change because these leaders in the world are very smart people. They're going to use this as a leverage to change behavior and then maybe get acceptance to university. Government's stance from the get-go was not conditional. They have to not accept all students at all. Simply cannot use that as a leverage. Moreover, we told you that they will simply make a Kim Jong-il's or Kim Il-sung school on their soil and simply not going to be very good for their education. Would you prefer your son, or would you prefer the son of Kim Jong-il being educated by Harvard University or by Kim Jong-il University, dogmatized by North Korean version of history and math and whatever Jen likes and stuff? Second question in this debate is that of change. We told you that learning democratic values, learning Western values, having that discourse, having that peer pressure is going to create long-term change. And we have the successful cases of Xi Jinping and Shen Mu. Their response was basically none. They told you that it's very difficult because there's power relations back home and stuff. We also told you that at least we have to try. No response there. And their argument about, for example, legitimization and hope are simply nonsense at all. Their point of legitimization was going to Harvard. Son of Kim Jong-il going to Harvard University is going to legitimize the whole regime. We told you from the get-go, people don't think like that, right? Just because your son goes to university doesn't mean we think the regime is okay. We actually want to educate that son in a Western way so that we can change the society, right? So at the end of the day, the question basically comes down to, would you want to go? Would you let your son or the son of Kim Jong-il go to Harvard or Kim Jong-il school? I think the question is very clear. Thank you very much.
spoke for 4 minutes and 25 seconds.
I'd like to now call the last speaker for today's debates.
So Elmo did point out that this is a mock debate, hence an educational purpose is also intrinsic in there. Let me also teach you what you can learn from the opposition. As you can see from the case, it's basically built like an LSAT question, right? They almost intentionally gave you logical fallacies for you to catch on to. I'll point out what the answers are for that a little later. They also made their case line look like an episode of My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, because, you know, it doesn't matter what happened. We tried, right? You know, yeah. Now, one course of philosophy and history in like Western democracies that's worth about, what, 3 credits a year? That's what we're missing, right? And then we have the desperate web speaker coming up here making cheap shots about Jen and NC's capacities. There's something that you should also remember. If you want to persuade people, lower your voice and make better arguments. That is the thing that you will learn from today's opposition. Okay, so let me get to you what this debate really was about. This debate was a cost-benefit analysis debate. You need to understand what we are pointing out as harms and what they are pointing out as benefits. First of all, the harms. We already gave you the point that these universities are not receiving these people because they want to educate and teach them the nice values of Western democracy. Most of these children either take courses in architecture, business administration, or things that have nothing to do with politics. Why are they receiving them? It's because, like we said again, Harvard needs a new soccer field. That is the only reason they're doing this. They're saying that it's against meritocracy. We discriminate all the time. There's things called affirmative action policies. What you do to receive people and what you do in action does represent what a university is standing for. When you're starting to accept people that you openly go and say you're ashamed to be associated with, and you still, like we said again, take the money, that's kind of proving a point that you are somewhat screwed up. We also talked about the legitimacies about how is it that when banks, I don't know what kind of country has a bank for a government, banks, oil companies, retail companies, when they try to go into a country that's sanctioned, they get held up by a grand jury. But if it's a university, heck, you know, it's okay because it's service. Yeah, like banks started selling things like PlayStations. I don't know what that happened. And it's okay, you know why? Because it's a university. No, it's awesome. There is no consistency with this side, saying that, you know, it's cool, right? Because the latter part, like Scott comes up here and says, we tried. Come on, give us some credit for that. In preschool, that's okay. But if you're talking about values and policy, trying doesn't cut the deal if the results are detrimental. There are actually unique harms that the proposition was trying to say that was not really engaged. So trying doesn't cut it. When Assad comes to New York and pays Beyonce Knowles to sing for his birthday party and takes, you know, architecture classes in LSE and comes back and kills more people. When Kim Jong-un gets education from Switzerland and comes back and kills more people than his father did, trying doesn't cut it. Now, does it? The harms that we talked about is that there are intrinsic harms, that there are harms that these people are sending them to. Do you think that Kim Jong-un actually got good SAT scores to get into these universities? Do you think Assad or Uday or all these other people like Nigerian Vice President Atuktu got a good SAT score? And that's why meritocracy points out that we should accept them. This is not about glittery-eyed, nice people that want an education. These are people that their family sent to legitimize their regimes. And that is the only reason why they're sending them, and the only reason why universities are receiving them, because they need the extra cash. That's not right to make them, again, like rainbow ponies, where they're like, oh, I just want an education. No, that's not the case. We told you that it legitimizes these governments. We told you that it's because that it gives Saul's hope. Maybe this time it might work. They talk about Shen Wu, you know, the guy that sounds like, you know Jackie Chan's stunt partner. We don't know if he actually will change yet now, do we? We heard from Assad that he's a different person from Daddy-O. We heard from Kim Jong-un that I'm not like my Daddy-O. He's not really that different now from his Daddy-O, now is he? The only thing that you have from here, therefore, is hope. You know, rainbow hope, you know, pretty hope, the sunshine and puppy type of hope. We told you that there are intrinsic harms. The universities are losing out from their principles. They're getting blood money out of it. And they're also not really doing much. At the same time, you're sacrificing opportunities for these countries to have their own infrastructure and getting their own things done. So think, again, ladies and gentlemen, if you're here to watch a Cartoon Network animation episode, then vote for them. But if you're really a person with thinking faculties, you know who to vote for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all debaters. Please cross floor, shake hands. 하나 말았어.